Elena had never imagined that a single night could collapse her entire world, that a simple dinner with her family could be hijacked into a decision she never agreed to. Yet here she was, standing in the cold marble hallway of the Mafia Boss's mansion, heart hammering as if each beat carried the weight of not only her life, but her brother's. And her brother, oh, little Adrian, had always been the one she promised to protect, promised to shield from all harm, from all darkness. And now the darkness itself was in front of her, tall, composed, and impossibly dangerous, his presence filling the room in a way that made every shadow retreat respectfully, the kind of silence that threatened rather than comforted. He was Damien Moretti, the most feared mafia boss in the city, a man who ruled empires through quiet power and deadly precision, a man whose reputation alone could paralyze a room and whose smile could terrify or seduce, depending on which side of his empire you were standing. And now he stood mere feet from her, dark tailored suit blending perfectly with the dim lights of the hallway, eyes sharp like knives honed for centuries of observing betrayal. And Elena's stomach churned because in that moment she understood the cruel equation fate had written for her. Adrian's safety now hinged entirely on her proximity to a man she had never wanted, never even met before this calamity, never signed any agreement with, and yet he had arrived at their modest family home that evening, polite yet imposing, delivering news with a voice that vibrated authority more than mercy. One life for one promise. Your brother lives, you will marry me. Elena's pulse had stopped briefly, as if the words themselves had strangled her heartbeat. She opened her mouth to protest, to scream, to reject this absurdity, yet no words came, because words are meaningless when death hovers, when a man's power could crush not just her protest, but everything she loved if ignored. And Adrian, seated quietly on the sofa, scared but oblivious to the full scope, looked up at her with pleading eyes, silently begging her to do what she must, even if it meant giving herself away, a silent message more compelling than any force Damien could have used. She wanted to scream, to collapse, to throw herself at him and demand that this was impossible, but the very air around Damien Moretti suggested the word impossible no longer belonged to ordinary people like her. I can't, she stammered finally, trying to gather courage against the gravity of the sentence he had issued. Damien stepped closer, measured, his scent a faint mix of cologne and something more primitive, commanding, a scent that whispered dominance and ownership without a single touch. He said, "You don't have a choice." Calm, not cruel, but certainty in his tone demanded obedience like a law of nature, not a human negotiation. Elena trembled, but her mind raced. If she said no, Adrian would pay the price, and she couldn't live with that guilt. She had promised to protect him, to guard him with her life, and now her life had become the currency for his survival. Hours passed intense negotiation, though the negotiation was hers alone. Damien's decisions were already final. He presented no documents, no contracts. He didn't need them. In his world, a promise spoken was binding, and a refusal was unthinkable. Elena finally nodded, trembling. I will marry you," she whispered, and the words tasted like poison on her tongue. She had agreed to something she never wanted for a reason she never wished to face. Yet Adrian's relief at hearing her agreement was enough to shatter any lingering resistance inside her, because family always outweighed personal desires, always outweighed fear, and now she would have to live every day beside a man who both terrified and intrigued her, whose silence spoke louder than any threat, whose eyes measured not just compliance but truth in her heart. And truth was, Elena felt the first seed of something she couldn't yet name. Fear? Yes, but also an unfamiliar pull, a dangerous curiosity about a man whose power eclipsed everything she had ever known. By the next morning, she was dressed in the pale silk of a wedding dress she had never chosen, standing in a grand cathedral that looked nothing like the small chapel where she had grown up, the organ booming softly behind her, echoes bouncing like distant threats. And Damien appeared beside her, silent, composed, eyes scanning the room as if calculating risks instead of admiring the scenery. His hand rested near hers, not touching, but close enough that proximity itself felt like a claim, a warning. And in that instant, Elena realized that marriage in this world wasn't a celebration. It was a transaction with emotional consequences far more lethal than bullets. and she was now irrevocably tied to a man whose empire could destroy or protect, whose gaze could command obedience, and whose protection came at a price higher than any she had ever imagined paying. As the priest intoned the words, Elena's mind drifted back to Adrian, safely seated behind velvet ropes, eyes shining with hope and relief, and she felt her heart fracture in pieces knowing that her sacrifice, her submission, would buy him life. But for herself, life under Damien's shadow would be a test she had not prepared for, a world she had not agreed to enter, and a journey into a slow-burn romance, danger, and unspoken emotions that would demand every ounce of courage she could muster. The first vows were exchanged quietly. Words felt like formalities, for the real covenant had already been sealed the night before, a silent agreement between her will to survive and Damien's inexorable power, and the first chapter of her unwillingly entwined destiny had begun. The morning after the wedding, Elena woke in a bedroom that was impossibly large, walls lined with paintings depicting landscapes she had never seen and faces she didn't recognize, chandeliers dripping crystals that refracted the sunlight into a kaleidoscope of gold and white, yet all of it felt cold and impersonal, as if the grandeur itself was meant to remind her that she had entered a world where she was merely a piece on someone else's chessboard. She sat on the edge of the massive bed, hands clasped tightly in her lap, heart still racing from the events of the previous night, and the realization settled over her like a stone. She was now married to a man she did not love, a man whose power over life and death dwarfed her entire existence, and the one reason she had agreed to this, her brother's safety, was the only tether keeping her from spiraling into panic. Adrian's laughter from the next room drifted faintly to her ears, and she felt a pang of guilt that was equal parts relief. He was safe, for now, because she had given herself away, because she had silenced her protests in exchange for his life, and in the quiet of that opulent bedroom, Elena allowed herself to shiver at the magnitude of the deal she had never truly consented to. The first hours in the mansion passed in an awkward, tense silence, punctuated only by the soft clicking of Damien's polished shoes echoing through the marble halls and the occasional distant bark of a guard's command to a subordinate. Elena moved slowly through the rooms, each one more luxurious than the last, but the luxury offered no comfort. It was intimidating, designed to remind her that in Damien Moretti's world, appearances were weapons, and every detail, from the rich fabrics to the heavy drapes that muted the city's noise, was part of a carefully constructed environment where safety and danger were inseparable. She paused at a large window overlooking the gardens, watching the fountain glisten in the morning sun, its gentle splashing a fragile reminder of calm in a world otherwise ruled by calculation and risk. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine what life might have been like if her family had not been caught in the crosshairs of a mafia feud she had never asked to be a part of. But the fantasy dissolved quickly. A single glance over her shoulder reminded her that she was not alone, that Damien's presence was everywhere in the mansion even when he was not visible, a constant reminder of the binding agreement she had never willingly signed. By late morning, Damien appeared in the library, where sunlight filtered through tall arched windows, dust motes dancing in the golden light, and he moved silently to the desk, settling into a chair as if he owned not just the room, but every thought that passed through her mind. Elena felt her stomach tighten, a combination of fear, defiance, and a strange, unnameable curiosity she tried desperately to suppress. And when she spoke, her voice trembled, despite her efforts to remain composed. "Where do I even begin?" Damien's gaze lifted slowly, dark eyes measuring, analyzing, and though he said nothing immediately, the silence itself was a lesson. Beginnings were defined not by words, but by actions, by the expectations laid upon her in this new world she had entered uninvited. He finally spoke, calm and deliberate. "You begin by learning the rules. You are now part of this life whether you like it or not. Protecting your brother comes with obligations you cannot ignore. The first is obedience." His words were not cruel nor were they kind, they were simply reality.
presented with the weight of inevitability that Elena had already come to recognize as absolute. She swallowed hard and nodded, fighting back a wave of indignation and fear. The thought that she might resist, even slightly, was quickly suppressed. Damien's subtle dominance in the room was impossible to ignore, an invisible force that commanded compliance without a word of overt threat. Elena moved through the day learning the boundaries of her new existence, where she could walk, when she could speak, what questions were safe, and which could endanger not only herself, but Adrian. Every instruction was delivered in calm tones, every correction implicit in the way Damien's presence lingered just behind her, a shadow she could neither escape nor fully comprehend. Even as she prepared a simple breakfast for herself and Adrian, she felt eyes on her constantly, noting movements, assessing intentions, weighing threats, and she realized that she was living under scrutiny more intense than any she had experienced before. And yet, paradoxically, the scrutiny existed not to punish, but to protect. Later, Damien escorted her to a room filled with wardrobes and dresses, offering a selection for her first public appearances as his wife, and Elena felt a strange mix of resentment and fascination at the care he took in presenting options that would not compromise her safety. It was meticulous, almost obsessive, and while she resented the underlying implication that her choices were being monitored and controlled, she could not deny that each garment, each accessory, was chosen to protect her in ways subtle but effective. In those moments, she caught glimpses of a side of Damien she had not anticipated, the meticulousness, the strategic foresight, the paradoxical tenderness hidden beneath layers of intimidation and calculated dominance. And though Elena would never admit it aloud, a small, cautious part of her began to acknowledge that survival under Damien's command was safer and perhaps even strangely compelling in ways her heart was not ready to analyze. Evening arrived with a tense dinner, a quiet gathering of key figures from Damien's world, men and women who radiated authority and danger in equal measure, their eyes flicking to Elena as she entered the room, evaluating, measuring, cataloging her presence as one would an unknown variable in an equation with high stakes. She felt exposed, a small civilian thrust into a universe of power where a single misstep could have lethal consequences. Yet Damien remained at her side, silent and unwavering, a protective anchor in a sea of subtle menace. His gaze never wavered from the assembled company, but it flickered to her occasionally, assessing, judging, ensuring her compliance, and more importantly, her safety. And Elena could not ignore the conflicting emotions that stirred within her: fear, gratitude, and an uneasy curiosity that she could not name or control. After dinner, Damien led her to a balcony overlooking the city lights, the night air crisp and fragrant with autumn leaves, and Elena felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her chest. She could not speak of consent, of choice, or of the life she had once imagined. Those possibilities had been taken by circumstance, by necessity, by the silent bargain she had been forced to make. And yet in that moment, under the stars and beside a man whose power could both terrify and protect, Elena realized that survival in Damien's world required more than obedience. It required vigilance, courage, and an understanding that her life and her heart were now part of a game she had never asked to play, a game where the stakes were impossibly high and the rules were defined not by fairness, but by power, loyalty, and unspoken agreements that bound her to a man she had never agreed to marry and a world that she could never fully leave.
The following morning, Elena awoke to the muted sunlight filtering through the heavy drapes, the faint scent of roses drifting from the gardens below, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life of normalcy, a life where Adrian was safe and the weight of obligation did not press so heavily against her chest. Yet reality settled like ice in her stomach when she remembered Damien's presence, silent but inescapable, as he had already begun his meticulous supervision of her days,
guiding every movement, subtly shaping her routines so that danger, invisible yet omnipresent, could be minimized. Breakfast was served in the small dining alcove near the library, where the sunlight highlighted Damien's angular features and the sharp lines of his tailored suit, and though he did not speak much, each glance he cast toward her was calculated, assessing, protective in a way that made her heart pound unpredictably. And yet, she could not mistake the authority in his demeanor, the sense that he would allow nothing to threaten her or Adrian while she remained under his roof. Elena moved mechanically through the motions, pouring tea and arranging plates, yet every gesture felt laden with significance, each action measured against an invisible standard she had yet to understand. And she realized that in this house, in this world, survival depended on attunement to the subtle rhythms of power that Damien dictated without ever raising his voice, without ever issuing an overt command. His control flowed like water, shaping the environment without ever seeming to touch it directly. And Elena, inexperienced but determined, had to learn quickly, for any hesitation could imperil not only her own life, but that of her brother, the very reason she had agreed to the marriage she had never wanted. Later that day, Damien led her into the estate's private training rooms, not to teach combat, but to familiarize her with situational awareness, the architecture of danger, and the behaviors that could keep her safe in the presence of people who operated under codes she had never been expected to understand. Elena's senses sharpened with each step, each instruction, her mind racing to absorb the lessons, and even as she resented the implications, that her life had become a constant exercise in vigilance, she could not deny the effectiveness of Damien's methods, nor the way he conveyed information without intimidation, instead relying on observation and subtle cues, teaching her to anticipate threats and read intentions as if she were learning a language she had never studied, a language of survival spoken in silence, gestures, and the quiet dominance of a man who demanded compliance without the need for force. His presence was constant, a shadow moving just behind her peripheral vision, always near enough to intervene, to protect, yet never crossing the line into physical possession, a calculated balance of authority and restraint that kept Elena on edge while simultaneously reassuring her that the bargain she had struck, her life for Adrian's, was being honored. And despite her unease, a flicker of respect for Damien's discipline and foresight began to take root, even as fear remained her constant companion. The afternoon brought a series of unexpected visitors, key figures from Damien's world who arrived under the guise of social courtesy, but whose eyes betrayed a sharp, predatory calculation, as if measuring Elena herself as part of the Empire's ongoing chess game. She felt exposed and unprepared, but Damien's presence at her side created an invisible shield, a subtle yet unbreakable barrier that dictated how these men and women could interact with her. And Elena realized that his protection was both literal and psychological, instilling in her a sense of security that she had never known, though it came with the constant reminder that she was not free, that her choices were still circumscribed by the demands of a world she had entered unwillingly. Throughout the meeting, Damien's glances toward her were intermittent but precise, as if he could communicate volumes with the smallest shift of his eyes, and she found herself both terrified and fascinated by the complex power dynamics at play, understanding that every movement, every tone, and every unspoken word could carry consequences far beyond anything she had ever imagined in her ordinary life. As evening descended, Elena was escorted to the estate's gardens, where autumn leaves crunched softly underfoot and the fountains whispered with gentle rhythm, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the day. Damien followed at a measured distance, silent, but the weight of his presence was tangible, anchoring her in a world where danger was never far away, yet his restraint demonstrated a calculated trust, a subtle acknowledgement that while she was inexperienced, she was learning quickly, adapting to the patterns of survival he had imposed upon her. Elena paused at a stone bench, hands folded in her lap, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had entered this marriage unwillingly, her freedom compromised, her agency curtailed, yet she could not deny that the man who now held dominion over her world also ensured that she and Adrian remained alive, untouched by the lethal consequences that lurked beyond the estate's walls. In that quiet, amber-lit space, she felt the first stirrings of something dangerous and unpredictable, a reluctant admiration tinged with fear for a man who embodied both peril and protection, whose enigmatic presence left her heart fluttering even as her mind screamed for caution, a tension that would define the days and nights to come in a life she had never asked for, but could not escape. Night fell and the mansion's corridors grew quiet, except for the soft echoes of guards patrolling distant wings, and Elena found herself seated by a window overlooking the city, wrapped in a shawl that carried the faint scent of Damien's cologne, a reminder that his influence extended even into the private sanctuaries of her thoughts. She traced the city lights with her eyes, contemplating the future that had been thrust upon her, the life she had been forced into, and the fragile sense of security she felt in his presence. Despite the fear, despite the resentment, she acknowledged that his methods, his calculated distance, and his unwavering attention had created a paradoxical environment, one in which she could breathe safely while simultaneously learning the rules of survival in a world that demanded obedience, vigilance, and emotional resilience. In that moment, she understood that the marriage was more than a transaction. It was a crucible, forging her into someone capable of navigating the complexities of power, loyalty, and protection. A world where love, perhaps, would one day emerge slowly and unexpectedly from the shadows of necessity and danger.
The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm, one dictated entirely by Damien's meticulous control and Elena's cautious adaptation. Each morning, she awoke to the quiet insistence of routine, the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the mansion's heavy drapes, and the knowledge that every movement, every word was under observation, even if it was silent, even if it was subtle. Damien did not hover, yet his presence was omnipresent. It was in the careful arrangement of her schedule, the slight tilt of his head when she answered questions too quickly or hesitated too long, the invisible pressure that reminded her she was living in a world where any misstep could ripple outward with consequences she could not anticipate. And yet, paradoxically, the same presence that imposed such intense vigilance also offered protection, a shield against threats Elena could barely comprehend, against enemies whose existence she had never imagined until she saw them in fleeting glimpses. The rival family's emissaries, the distant guards reporting in coded messages, the faint trace of surveillance that reminded her she was never truly alone. The mansion, so magnificent and intimidating, became both prison and sanctuary, and Elena navigated its corridors with a careful attentiveness that soon became instinctive, a constant balancing act between fear and gratitude, obligation, and the first stirrings of curiosity about the man who dominated her life, yet guarded it so diligently. One afternoon, Damien summoned her to his private study, a room lined with books and artifacts from centuries of Moretti family history, the weight of tradition pressing against the air like gravity itself. Elena entered hesitantly, aware of the unspoken rules of the space, and found him seated behind a massive desk, posture perfect, expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and expectant, until he finally spoke, his voice smooth, deliberate, commanding attention without the slightest effort. "You are learning quickly. That pleases me." Elena's chest tightened at the unexpected praise. It was rare, almost foreign, coming from a man who measured every word and gesture.
She lowered her gaze, uncertain how to respond, yet the simple acknowledgement of her adaptability stirred an uneasy warmth inside her, a dangerous feeling she could not define, and one that she quickly tried to suppress, reminding herself that gratitude for survival did not equate to affection. Damien's eyes, however, betrayed nothing of judgment or indulgence. They were steady, observing, calculating, and Elena realized that the power he wielded over her extended beyond life and death. He understood how to manipulate subtler realms, shaping her emotions, her thoughts, her understanding of danger, without ever forcing her hand. As the afternoon waned into evening, Elena found herself wandering into the gardens, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant roses, and for the first time since the wedding, she allowed herself to breathe freely, if only briefly. The fountain glistened under the fading sunlight, its gentle rhythm a stark contrast to the tension that pervaded the mansion's interior. Damien joined her silently, not speaking, merely walking at a measured distance that suggested both proximity and deference, a paradox that she could not reconcile. Her hands, clasped loosely in front of her, betrayed the small tremors of unease and anticipation, and she felt the first faint recognition of attraction, a curiosity she could not justify and would not admit, a dangerous spark igniting in the shadow of her fear. Even as she tried to focus on Adrian, imagining him safe and content within the mansion, her thoughts kept returning to Damien, to the way he moved, the precision of his gaze, the subtle assurance in his posture that spoke volumes about his control and his intent to protect. And she shivered, both from fear and from an unfamiliar, involuntary fascination that she could not explain. Night brought with it a quiet dinner for the two of them, away from the eyes of the household and the emissaries of rival families, and the intimacy of the setting, though not romantic in the conventional sense, created a space where conversation flowed differently, more cautiously, more deliberately, yet with a subtle tension that made each word carry weight. Damien asked questions about her life before the wedding, about her family, about Adrian, and Elena answered carefully, aware that truth was currency here, as was discretion, and that revealing too much or too little could have consequences she could not predict. The conversation was interlaced with silences that felt almost physical, a language in itself, and Elena realized that she was learning the contours of Damien's mind as much as he was learning hers, where to tread, where to retreat, where the boundaries of safety and danger intersected, and where perhaps the first fragile threads of trust might eventually take root. She noted with a mixture of relief and trepidation that Damien was patient, even in his authority. He did not press too hard, but his attention never wavered, and the awareness of being observed, understood, and protected simultaneously created a complex web of emotions within her, a mixture of gratitude, apprehension, and that indefinable pull that made her heart race even as her mind insisted on caution. Later, as Elena retired to her chambers, the weight of the day settled heavily upon her. She sat at the window, gazing at the city lights twinkling below, reflecting on the delicate balance she had begun to navigate, the delicate dance between obedience and autonomy, fear and fascination, duty and desire. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that survival in Damien's world required more than compliance. It demanded insight, adaptability, and a willingness to recognize and respect the power dynamics that governed every interaction. And beneath that understanding, there was a growing awareness that the man she had married to save her brother was more than a distant, intimidating figure. He was a presence that commanded both respect and involuntary curiosity, a man whose influence reached into her thoughts and emotions, shaping her perceptions as he protected her life. She shivered softly, wrapped in a shawl that carried the faint scent of his cologne, and realized that the days ahead would not merely be a test of survival. They would be a test of the heart, the mind, and the courage required to navigate the perilous intersection of duty, love, and power.
The tension in the mansion escalated over the following days, subtle at first, a quiet murmur of activity that hinted at the world beyond its walls, but growing into a presence Elena could no longer ignore. She noticed the guards moving with greater urgency, their eyes sharper, the hushed conversations in corridors carrying the weight of decisions she was not yet privy to, and the first clear sign that danger was approaching arrived with the sudden appearance of a courier, bearing a sealed envelope with the Moretti crest stamped in blood-red wax. Damien took it without a word, breaking the seal with practiced hands and reading in silence, the lines of his face tightening imperceptibly, though his calm remained unshaken. Elena watched from a distance, heart pounding, as she realized that the life she had thought protected by marriage was far more precarious than she had imagined. The world Damien commanded was vast and dangerous, and her presence in it was a guarantee not of comfort, but of exposure. She longed to speak, to ask the questions that burned in her mind, but the weight of the moment silenced her, and when Damien finally folded the letter and slid it into his coat pocket, his gaze flicked to her briefly, and for the first time she felt the full force of the silent command that had defined their days since the wedding. Trust him, obey, survive. That evening, he summoned her to the private study once again, a ritual that had become both instruction and subtle psychological assessment. Elena entered quietly, careful not to disturb the heavy air of authority that clung to the room, and found Damien seated behind the desk, his expression unreadable, the faint glow of a desk lamp casting sharp shadows across his chiseled features. He gestured for her to sit, and she did so, the chair creaking softly under her weight, a reminder of the physical reality of her presence in his domain. "The letter," he began without a preamble, "is from a rival family. They are aware of your role in my household. They question loyalty and, more importantly, opportunity. They will test it." His voice was even, almost cold, yet there was an underlying intensity that made Elena shiver despite herself. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat, aware that her own fear was a tool Damien could use to teach her, to shape her reactions, to mold her understanding of this perilous world. And she realized that the survival skills he had begun instilling were no longer abstract exercises. They were immediate necessities, lessons in anticipation, strategy, and the quiet endurance of tension that could erupt into violence at any moment. Over the next several hours, Damien guided her through a series of exercises designed to improve her awareness, observing patterns of movement within the mansion, identifying potential threats among staff and visitors, and rehearsing responses to hypothetical crises. Elena followed each instruction meticulously, absorbing details with the keen focus of someone whose own life, and her brother's, depended on her attention to the smallest signals. Despite the fear that prickled her skin, a part of her began to feel a tentative respect for Damien's methods, for the way he balanced authority with a subtle form of mentorship that demanded discipline without cruelty. She realized that in learning to navigate this world, she was also learning to understand him, to glimpse the mind of a man who operated with precision, strategy, and an almost obsessive commitment to the safety of those he deemed worth protecting. And while she resented the lack of choice that had brought her here, she could not deny the effectiveness of his approach. As dusk settled, Damien accompanied her to the mansion gardens, the orange and purple hues of the setting sun painting the fountain in golden light, the scent of autumn leaves mingling with roses trimmed with military precision. For a moment, they walked in silence, each step measured, each glance purposeful, and Elena felt the strange duality of fear and fascination intensifying. Damien's proximity, the steady rhythm of his movements beside her, the unspoken authority he exerted without force, created an electric tension that she could neither name nor escape. A breeze stirred, lifting strands of her hair across her face, and Damien reached subtly, brushing it aside with a hand that hovered near hers for an instant longer than necessary, a silent assertion of attention, of ownership, of control, and she felt her heart lurch involuntarily. She reminded herself that attraction was dangerous, a vulnerability she could not afford, yet her body and mind betrayed her, reacting to the proximity, the presence,
the quiet command that emanated from him without a single word. That night, Elena lay awake, listening to the distant footsteps of guards patrolling the mansion, replaying every interaction of the day, every glance, every subtle gesture. The sense of vulnerability and fascination wove together into a complex knot she could not unravel, a mix of respect, fear, and an unfamiliar pull toward the man whose power had compelled her into this marriage. She knew that tomorrow would bring new lessons, new tests of her adaptability and endurance, and that the threats outside the mansion's walls would grow more tangible as rival families sensed weakness. Yet she also realized that the most difficult challenge lay not in navigating the external dangers, but in navigating the storm of emotions Damien had begun to stir within her, a storm that she could neither name nor control, and one that would define the precarious balance of life, loyalty, and the first stirrings of a dangerous, forbidden fascination in the days to come.
The days that followed were a delicate dance of shadows and light, obligation and curiosity, fear and fascination, and Elena found herself navigating a world she had once only glimpsed in the warnings of her father and the stories whispered in the streets. The mansion no longer felt entirely alien. She had learned the rhythms of the staff, the subtle signs of danger, the quiet ways in which Damien's presence shaped every room without ever touching it. And yet every lesson came with the constant reminder that her life, and Adrian's, remained tethered to a man whose power could both protect and consume her. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the distant city skyline, Damien called her to the estate's private balcony, the air crisp with autumn wind, the fountains below shimmering in fading light. And for the first time he spoke with a softness that contradicted the rigid authority she had come to expect. "You have adapted quickly," he said, voice steady but low, carrying a weight that was both commanding and intimate. "But there is more to survival than obedience. There is understanding, awareness, and trust." Elena felt the words penetrate deeper than any lesson in vigilance. Trust was a language she had not yet learned, a currency she had been forced to spend without consent, and yet the way Damien's eyes held hers, steady and unwavering, conveyed something beyond protection, a quiet acknowledgement that her life, her choices, and even her reluctance were recognized and respected within the confines of his own strict code. The following days brought increasing pressure as rival families sent subtle challenges, each an unseen threat that tested the strength of Damien's protection and Elena's capacity to remain composed under scrutiny. Couriers delivered letters, guards intercepted strangers, and meetings were orchestrated to ensure the safety of the household while projecting an image of seamless control. Elena learned to read the rhythms of these interactions, to anticipate when tension would rise, and to respond with careful observation rather than panic, a skill she never imagined possessing. With every passing challenge, she began to understand the depth of Damien's planning, the intelligence behind every move, and the quiet intensity that defined him. It became clear that while fear had initially defined her marriage, respect, and, in a subtle, reluctant way, fascination had begun to emerge, a recognition that survival in this world required more than compliance. It demanded attunement, discernment, and, perhaps unexpectedly, emotional resilience. One late evening, a sudden disturbance in the gardens, a noise too deliberate to be natural, sent Elena's heart racing, and without thought, she moved toward the source, instincts sharpened by days of subtle training. Damien appeared immediately beside her, silent and commanding, and together they observed from the shadows a figure attempting to breach the perimeter, unaware of the eyes that watched him. Damien's calm efficiency, his precise commands to the guards, and his unwavering focus on ensuring both her safety and the neutralization of the threat left Elena both awed and unnervingly aware of his power. Once the intruder had been subdued and the mansion secured, she turned to him,
voice trembling slightly despite her training. You saved me again." He met her gaze steadily, a faint acknowledgement in his eyes, but without sentimentality. "I protect what is mine," he said simply, and the words carried a weight she could not ignore, a declaration of possession that was both literal and symbolic, the first subtle admission that the bond forged between them, though unchosen by her, had taken on its own life, defined by the realities of survival, loyalty, and unspoken understanding. The nights grew longer, and as autumn deepened, the mansion seemed to pulse with life and tension simultaneously. Elena began to see Damien in moments of unexpected vulnerability. The brief flicker of emotion when Adrian spoke of school, the almost imperceptible sigh when a rival's message arrived, the quiet adjustments he made to ensure her comfort without diminishing his authority. These glimpses, fleeting and subtle, stirred emotions within her she struggled to define: gratitude, fascination, and the first hesitant threads of attraction that, while unacknowledged, made her pulse quicken and her thoughts linger on him beyond the necessities of survival. In private moments, when the household was silent and the stars stretched across the night sky, she began to notice the way his gaze lingered just slightly longer than required, the softness that appeared in his posture when she asked questions or hesitated, and the careful distance he maintained, even as he allowed her a closeness she could not fully understand. It was an intricate, silent dance of power, trust, and unspoken emotion that neither of them named, yet both felt with growing intensity. One evening, as a gentle rain fell over the estate, Elena found herself on the balcony, watching the droplets shimmer against the distant lights of the city. Damien joined her quietly, offering no words, only presence, and for a moment the world outside the mansion ceased to exist, replaced by the silent tension between them, the subtle pull of attraction, and the undeniable reality of shared danger and responsibility. Elena's hand brushed against the railing, and she felt a pulse of warmth not entirely her own, a recognition that the man beside her, who had once been solely a figure of authority and fear, had become someone she could depend on, trust in, a way she never anticipated, and even feel something more toward. He turned slightly, eyes catching the reflections of rain on the glass, and in the quiet of that shared space, a silent understanding passed between them. Her survival and Adrian's safety had brought them together, but something deeper, something unspoken and inexorable, had begun to root itself in the spaces between fear, duty, and fascination. As the story drew to its subtle crescendo, Elena realized that life in Damien's world was far from simple, that every day required vigilance, courage, and emotional endurance, but also that the very man she had married out of necessity had become an anchor, a protector, and, without acknowledgement, a presence that stirred feelings she could neither deny nor fully understand. In the quiet moments before sleep, she allowed herself to acknowledge a fragile hope that within the confines of a world built on danger, loyalty, and silent power, there existed the possibility of something deeper, a connection that might grow from the shadows, and that her heart, once bound only by obligation, might one day beat in rhythm with the man whose dominion first inspired fear, then respect, and now an unnameable, tender curiosity. And as Damien's footsteps echoed softly in the hall outside her room, she knew, with a certainty she could neither rationalize nor resist, that the story between them was only beginning, a narrative of survival, power, and the slow and inevitable unfolding of something neither of them had chosen, but both could not deny.